blood spatter analyst who kills like it's his second nature to a hopeless romantic who murders to keep the fantasy alive. This is Dexter Morgan versus Joe Goldberg. Two killers, two codes, and one question: who actually knows what they're doing? But who wins when the knives come out? Let's break it down. When it comes to raw physical confrontation, the difference between Dexter Morgan and Joel Goldberg becomes immediately apparent. One is a trained predator, while the other is a desperate improviser, at best. Dexter's advantage in hand-to-hand combat stems from years of methodical preparation under Harry's code, combined with his forensic expertise that taught him exactly how the human body breaks down. Joe, on the other hand, relies on surprise, desperation, and whatever blunt object happens to be within reach. Dexter's background gave him access to professional-grade training that most serial killers could only dream of. Working alongside Miami Metro's finest, he absorbed combat techniques, restraint methods, and tactical approaches that police officers spend years perfecting. Harry Morgan taught him how to kill and survive. This included basic self-defense, weapon handling, and most importantly, how to remain calm under physical pressure. Dexter's forensic work also meant that he understood anatomy better than almost anyone, knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage or how to incapacitate someone without leaving obvious evidence. Joe's education came from a very different school, the streets of New York, and whatever he could learn from stalking his obsessions. His physical skills developed out of necessity, desperation, and the occasional YouTube tutorial. The build-up to any physical confrontation reveals the total contrast in their approaches. Throughout the series, we've seen Dexter prepare for physical encounters with methodical precision. He scouts locations, prepares contingency plans, and ensures he has the proper tools and environment for success. When facing the Trinity Killer, Dexter studied Arthur Mitchell's patterns, weaknesses, and preferred methods before making his move. Joe's confrontations, however, typically escalate from his obsessive behavior spiraling out of control. His fight with Peach Salinger wasn't planned tactical warfare, it was a panic response to being discovered. Where Dexter calculates, Joe reacts. The main event analysis shows Dexter's overwhelming advantages in almost every combat scenario. His weapon proficiency extends far beyond his signature tools. We've seen him handle knives with surgical precision, but he's also comfortable with firearms, blunt instruments, and improvised weapons. His kills demonstrate someone who understands leverage, anatomy, and the most efficient ways to neutralize a threat. Dexter's physical conditioning, while not that of a professional athlete, is maintained through years of active field work and the physical demands of his double life. Joe's weapon proficiency is far more limited and situational. His kills tend to involve whatever's available, a rock or his bare hands in the moment of rage. While Joe has shown that he can be dangerous when cornered, his techniques lack the refinement and efficiency that Dexter displays. Joe's physical conditioning is average at best, more suited for following someone through Central Park than engaging in sustained physical combat. The immediate aftermath of physical confrontation reveals perhaps the most telling difference between them. Dexter approaches post-violence cleanup with the same methodical precision he brings to everything else. He planned for blood spatter, knows how to minimize DNA evidence, and has contingencies for disposing of any traces of the encounter. His forensic background means he's constantly thinking 3 steps ahead about what evidence might remain. Joe's aftermath management is far more chaotic and reactive. After his confrontation with Peach, he was clearly improvising his cover story and cleanup efforts. His approach to handling evidence often creates more problems than it solves, leaving digital footprints, witnesses, and loose ends that a more experienced killer like Dexter would never allow. The long-term repercussions of their different combat approaches create a widening gap in survival probability. Dexter's systematic training means he's prepared for escalation, knows how to de-escalate when necessary, and understands when retreat is the better option. His combat skills are integrated into a larger survival strategy that kept him alive and undetected for decades. Joe's reactive approach, while occasionally effective, creates cumulative risk that compounds over time. Each violent encounter leaves them more exposed, more likely to make mistakes, and more dependent on luck rather than skill. I think that Dexter's methodical training gives him a massive edge here. While Joe might have youth and desperation on his side, there's no substitute for professional grade preparation and decades of experience. Dexter approaches violence like a surgeon approaches an operation, with precision, preparation, and complete understanding of the process from start to finish. Joe treats violence like an emergency room visit, chaotic, unpredictable, and hoping for the best possible outcome. Now, if you're already seeing the gap between a forensic assassin and a guy who fights like it's his first bar brawl, go ahead and subscribe. It only gets more lopsided from here. But when it's brain over brawn, things actually do get interesting. In the realm of mental manipulation and psychological dominance, Joe Goldberg and Dexter Morgan represent two fundamentally different approaches to understanding and controlling human behavior. Joe's strength lies in his obsessive ability to insert himself in someone's life and reshape their reality, while Dexter's power comes from his complete emotional detachment and clinical analysis of human psychology. This creates a fascinating dynamic where Joe's greatest weapon His intense emotional investment could also be the very thing that destroys him when facing someone immune to traditional manipulation. Joe's obsessive research methods border on the supernatural in their thoughtness and invasiveness. He doesn't just study his targets, he becomes an expert on every aspect of their existence. Through social media stalking, breaking into homes, reading private communications, and following daily routines, Joe builds psychological profiles that would make FBI behavioral analysts jealous. His research into Beck's life was so comprehensive that he knew her fears, desires, and emotional triggers better than she knew herself. Joe understands that knowledge is power, and he weaponizes intimate details to create the illusion of perfect compatibility and understanding. Dexter's forensic analysis takes a completely different approach. He studies his victims like specimens under a microscope. His research focuses on patterns, evidence, and behavioral indicators that reveal the darkness he's hunting. Where Joe seeks emotional connection and control, Dexter seeks confirmation of guilt in the most efficient path to elimination. The way each studies and approaches their targets reveals the fundamental difference in their psychological strategies. Joe's approach is deeply personal and emotionally driven. He doesn't just want to understand his target, he wants to become indispensable to them. His stalking of Love Quinn showed how he creates elaborate scenarios to insert himself into someone's life, manufacturing chance encounters and emotional moments. Joe studies people to find their vulnerabilities, then positions himself as a solution to the problems he often created. Dexter's approach is methodical and detached. When researching the Trinity Killer, he studied crime scenes, victim patterns, and behavioral evidence without any emotional investment in the outcome. Dexter approaches targets like a hunter studying prey, learning habits, identifying weaknesses, and planning the most efficient approach to his ultimate goal. The main event comparison of their psychological games reveals two masters operating in completely different arenas. Joe's manipulation tactics are designed to create emotional dependency and reshape someone's perception of reality. He's a master of gaslighting, love bombing, and creating artificial intimacy that feels more real than actual relationships. His psychological games with Beck involved systematically isolating her from friends, creating crises that only he could solve, and manipulating her insecurities to make her rely on his approval. Joe wants willing surrender. Dexter's psychological manipulation serves a completely different purpose. He uses psychology to blend in, to appear normal, to position himself where he needs to be to accomplish his goals. His manipulation of Sergeant Dokes involves playing into the detective's suspicions while maintaining plausible deniability. Dexter doesn't seek emotional control over others, he seeks invisibility and access. The effectiveness of their mental strategies depends entirely on their intended targets and desired outcomes. Joe's psychological warfare is devastatingly effective against emotionally vulnerable individuals seeking connection and validation. His success with Beck, Love, and Marianne demonstrate his ability to exploit basic human needs for love and understanding. However, Joe's tactics require emotional receptivity from his targets. They work because his victims want to believe in the connection he's offering. Dexter's psychological strategies are designed for survival and mission completion rather than emotional control. His ability to maintain his mask of normalcy for decades, to work alongside law enforcement while actively killing, and to manipulate situations to his advantage demonstrate a different kind of psychological mastery. Dexter's mind games are just about making sure people overlook him. The immediate aftermath of their psychological manipulations revealed the sustainability and long-term effectiveness of each approach. Joe's psychological victories often become Pyrrhic. He wins the person but loses control of the situation. His manipulation of Beck ultimately led to her discovering his true nature, forcing him into increasingly desperate measures to maintain the illusion. Joe's psychological games tend to escalate, requiring more elaborate deceptions and creating more potential points of failure. Dexter's psychological manipulation, while less dramatic, proves more sustainable. His ability to maintain relationships with Rita, Deborah, and his colleagues for years without detection shows a more stable form of psychological control, one that doesn't require constant maintenance or escalation. Joe has never encountered someone completely immune to emotional manipulation, someone who simply doesn't process relationships and connections the way normal people do. His entire psychological arsenal is designed to exploit human emotional needs that Dexter simply doesn't have. On the other hand, Dexter has never faced someone whose obsession could match his own methodical persistence. Joe's ability to research, stalk, and insert himself into someone's life could potentially uncover aspects of Dexter's double life that law enforcement missed for years. The question of who breaks first under psychological pressure reveals the fundamental difference in their psychological makeup. Joe's obsessive nature means he's emotionally invested in outcomes in ways that create vulnerability. When his careful psychological construct starts failing, when the people he's manipulating begins to see through his games, Joe tends to unravel. His breakdown after Beck's death, his increasingly erratic behavior with Love, and his desperate attempts to start over with Marianne all show someone whose psychological stability depends on successful manipulation. Dexter's emotional detachment, while sometimes appearing to be a weakness, actually provides incredible psychological resilience. He doesn't break under pressure because he doesn't form the emotional attachments that create psychological vulnerabilities. Joe's obsession could both be his strength and a fatal weakness in a psychological war with Dexter. His ability to research and understand people is unmatched, and if anyone could uncover Dexter's true nature, it would be Joe. However, once Joe becomes obsessed with Dexter, and obsession is inevitable with Joe, he becomes predictable. Dexter has spent his entire life studying predators, and Joe's obsessive patterns would eventually become as readable as any crime scene. Joe's need for emotional validation and connection creates exploitable weaknesses that someone like Dexter, who feels no obligation to provide genuine emotional responses, could manipulate ruthlessly. But when the bodies pile up, who actually knows what they're doing? When examining the actual mechanics of murder, things get particularly interesting here. Dexter's ritual precision represents decades of refinement, systematic improvement, and an almost scientific approach to killing, while Joe's crime of passion methodology revealed someone who treats murder as an unfortunate necessity rather than a perfected art form. This fundamental difference in approach creates a massive gap in efficiency, success rates, and long-term sustainability that will likely determine the outcome of any direct confrontation between them. The driving force behind their killing methods reveal the psychological foundations that shape everything else. The Dark Passenger's influence on Dexter creates a methodical, almost ceremonial approach to murder that prioritizes precision, ritual, and psychological satisfaction through perfect execution. Dexter performs a carefully thought out ritual that serves both practical and psychological purpose. Every element, from the plastic sheeting to the victim's positioning, serves multiple functions: evidence containment, emotional satisfaction, and symbolic meaning. Joe's emotional triggers create an entirely different dynamic, where murder becomes a reactive solution to problems. His kills are driven by panic, jealousy, protective instincts, or desperation to maintain his carefully constructed lies. Where Dexter kills because of what his victims have done, Joe kills because of what they threaten to do to his emotional stability. Examining their signature killing styles reveal the vast gulf in their approaches to the craft of murder. Dexter's kill room setup has become iconic for good reason. It represents the pinnacle of organized killing. The plastic sheeting is positioned with mathematical precision to account for blood spatter patterns, body movement, and cleanup efficiency. His table restraints are designed to prevent escape while allowing for the psychological torture that precedes death. The ritual of showing victims their own crimes serves as both as psychological justification and as a way to ensure that Dexter maintains emotional distance from the act. Every tool has a specific purpose. Every step follows a logical progression, and every detail has been refined through years of practice. Joe's killing style, by contrast, is characterized by improvisation and immediate availability. His murder of Peach Salinger, his strangulation of Beck, and his various others show someone working with whatever tools and opportunities present themselves in the moment. A detailed breakdown of their methods, tools, and success rates shows Dexter operating at a completely different level of competency. Dexter's tool selection demonstrates professional-grade preparation, specialized knives for precise cutting, restraints designed for maximum security with minimum damage, plastic sheeting calculated for optimal blood containment, and disposal methods that have been tested and refined over time. His success rate in terms of completing kills without detection or complication is nearly perfect across hundreds of victims. Dexter's only failure typically comes from external interference rather than methodological flaws. When his system fails, it's usually because someone interrupted the process, not because the process itself was inadequate. Joe's tool selection reflects someone who treats murder as an emergency rather than a planted operation. Kitchen knives, household objects, improvised weapons, and whatever happens to be available to characterize his approach. His success rate is significantly lowered when measured against professional standards. While he has managed to kill several people, he also left witnesses, created suspicious circumstances, and generated far more investigative attention than someone of Dexter's experience would ever allow. The aftermath of their kills reveals perhaps the most stark difference in their operation capabilities. Dexter's body disposal and evidence management represents the gold standard of forensic countermeasures. His use of his both, the Gulf Stream and weighted body parts, ensure that physical evidence disappears permanently into the ocean's depths. His cleanup process accounts for DNA evidence, blood spatter, fingerprints, and any other forensic traces that might lead back to him. Dexter's forensic expertise means he's constantly thinking like the investigators who might eventually examine the scene. He knows exactly what they'll look for and how to ensure they won't find it. His evidence management extends beyond the immediate crime scene to include alibi construction, digital footprint management, and long-term operational security. Joe's aftermath management reveals someone operating far below professional standards. His burial of Beck's body, his attempt to cover up Peach's death, and his various other cleanup efforts show fundamental misunderstandings of forensic science and investigative procedures. Joe's evidence management often creates more problem than it solves. His digital activities leave traces. His physical evidence disposal is inadequate, and his cover stories frequently contain logical inconsistencies that would quickly quickly unravel under professional scrutiny. The question of which approach leaves fewer traces isn't even close to competitive. Dexter's systematic approach to evidence elimination means that most of his kills leave no physical evidence whatsoever. When bodies are never found, when crime scenes are perfectly clean, and when alibis are airtight, there's simply nothing for investigators to work with. Dexter's victims often disappear so completely that their deaths aren't even classified as homicides. They're missing person cases that eventually go cold. Joe's approach leaves traces everywhere. Digital footprints from his stalking activities, physical evidence from his break-ins, witness testimony from people who saw him near crime scenes, and forensic evidence from his improvised disposal methods. Even when Joe thinks he's covered his tracks, he's typically left enough evidence to build a case. The only reason why he hadn't been caught is luck and the fact that he never faced a truly competent investigation. The long-term repercussions of their different methodological approaches create compounding advantages for Dexter and escalating risk for Joe. Dexter's refined methods meant that each kill actually makes him safer by eliminating threats while leaving no evidence to connect him to the previous crimes. His systematic approach allows him to maintain operational security across decades and hundreds of victims. Joe's reactive methods meant that each kill creates new vulnerabilities and potential exposure points. His growing body count represents mounting evidence and escalating risk that makes eventual detection more likely with each subsequent crime. Dexter's ritualistic approach shows true professional experience in ways that go beyond simple technical competency. His methods reflect someone who understands murder as both a practical necessity and a psychological requirement. The ritual elements serve multiple purposes. They provide emotional satisfaction, ensure methodical execution, create psychological distance from the act, and establish repeatable procedures that minimize risk. Joe's approach reflects someone who views murder as an unfortunate side effect of his real obsessions rather than a perfected craft in its own right. If you're still rooting for Joe after that section, I don't know what to tell you, but drop a comment and defend your boy. Just be ready for Dexter fans to respond with evidence bags. And of course, killing's only half the job. Getting away with it is the real challenge. Dexter Morgan and Joe Goldberg operate from completely opposite positions when it comes to running from the law. One from inside the system looking out, the other from outside the system looking in. Dexter's inside law enforcement advantage represents perhaps the most significant tactical benefit any serial killer could possess, while Joe's tech savvy offers modern capabilities that didn't exist during most of Dexter's career. This creates a fascinating dynamic where traditional investigative methods clash with digital age surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. Dexter's position within Miami Metro Homicide provided him with advantages that most criminals could only dream of. Working as a blood spatter analyst meant that he was often first on crime scenes, had access to evidence before anyone else, and could subtly influence investigations from the very beginning. His forensic expertise wasn't just useful for committing perfect crimes, it allowed him to understand exactly how investigations would unfold and what evidence investigators would prioritize. Beyond the technical advantages, Dexter's relationship with fellow officers created a protective shield of trust and familiarity that made him virtually invisible to suspicion. When you're the guy helping solve murders, nobody suspects you're committing them. Joe's tech savvy represents a different kind of advantage, one that's increasingly relevant in the modern surveillance state. His ability to hack phones, manipulate social media, access private communications, and create false digital identities give him capabilities that traditional investigators often struggle to counter. Joe understands that in this digital age, information is power, and his ability to gather, manipulate, and control digital information provides him with tools that someone like Dexter, who operates primarily in the analog world, might not fully appreciate. The close calls each had with authorities reveal fundamentally different vulnerabilities and response strategies. Dexter's closest call typically comes from individual investigators who began to piece together patterns or develop personal suspicions. Sergeant Dokes, Agent Lundy, and Detective Quinn all represented different types of investigative threats. However, Dexter's position allowed him to monitor these investigations in real time, influence evidence, and sometimes even redirect suspicion towards other suspects. When Dokes began investigating him, Dexter actively worked to discredit Dokes while using his forensic position to stay ahead of the investigation. Joe's close calls have been more chaotic and reactive, typically resulting from his digital activities being discovered or his stalking behavior being noticed. His near exposure by Peach Salinger, his problems with Detective Delilah, and various other investigative pressures forced him into increasingly desperate measures. Unlike Dexter, Joe couldn't influence these investigations from the inside. He had to rely on manipulation, misdirection, and sometimes elimination of the investigators themselves. The main event comparison of their strategies for staying under the radar shows two different philosophies of operational security. Dexter's strategy revolves around hiding in plain sight while maintaining perfect technical execution. His day job provides both cover and access. His social relationships create alibis and character witnesses, and his forensic expertise ensure that his crimes leave no detectable evidence. Dexter works alongside them, learns from them, and uses their own methods against them. His strategy is built built on the assumption that if there is no evidence, there is no crime, and if there is no crime, there's no investigation. Simple enough. Joe's strategy involves digital manipulation, social engineering, and creating elaborate false narratives to explain his presence and activities. He uses technology to monitor potential threats, create fake identities, and manipulate digital evidence to support his cover stories. Joe's approach assumes that he'll eventually attract attention, so he focuses on controlling the narrative and misdirecting investigators rather than avoiding them entirely. How each handles investigations into their activities reveals the sustainability of their different approaches. When investigations get too close to Dexter, he has multiple options. He can use his forensic expertise to identify and eliminate evidence, leverage his relationships to redirect suspicion, or in extreme cases, eliminate the threat entirely while making it look like an accident or the work of another killer. His handling of the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation shows masterful manipulation of evidence and investigative procedures from the inside. Dexter didn't just survive that investigation, he helped solve it by framing someone else. Joe's handling of investigations tends to be more chaotic and desperate. When Detective Delilah began investigating him, Joe's response involved breaking into her home, manipulating her personal life, and ultimately having to eliminate her when the other methods failed. Joe's investigations tend to escalate rather than resolve, creating new problems and exposing him to additional risk. The long-term sustainability of their methods creates vastly different risk problems. Dexter's inside position means that his operational security actually improves over time as he gains experience, builds relationships, and refines his methods. Each successful kill potentially makes him safer by eliminating threats, while his day job provides increasing legitimacy and access. Dexter's methods is theoretically sustainable indefinitely. As long as he maintains his position and doesn't make major mistakes, he can continue operating with relative impunity. Joe's methods face increasing challenges as digital surveillance becomes more sophisticated, and his past activities create mounting evidence. Each new identity requires more elaborate deception, each new location means leaving behind potential evidence, and each new relationship creates additional exposure points. The repercussions of their different approaches to avoiding detection become clear when examining their operational longevity and success rates. Dexter operated successfully for decades, killing hundreds of people while maintaining his position and relationships. His only major exposure came from external factors: his relationship with Rita, his connection to Trinity Killer, and family obligations that forced him to deviate from his established patterns. Joe's operational history shows a pattern of escalating problems, forced relocations, and increasing desperations. His methods work in the short term but create compounding problems that eventually force him to abandon everything and start over. Dexter's police connection is an unfair advantage that Joe just can't match, and is probably the single most important factor in any comparison between them. While Joe's technical skills are impressive and increasingly relevant in the modern world, they can't compete with the fundamental advantage of being inside the system you're trying to avoid. Dexter doesn't just know how the investigations work, he helps conduct them. He doesn't just understand forensic science, he's considered an expert by his peers. He doesn't just avoid suspicion, he's trusted to help catch every type of criminal he actually is. But pressure doesn't just reveal cracks, it also decides who breaks first. When the carefully constructed facades begin to crumble and the walls start closing in, the true character of a killer emerges, not in their successes, but in how they respond to imminent failure. Dexter Morgan and Joe Goldberg have both faced moments where their entire worlds threaten to collapse, revealing fundamentally different approaches to crisis management that would likely determine the outcome of any confrontation between them. One maintains surgical precision even as everything falls apart, while the other spirals into increasingly erratic decision-making that compounds existing problems. The context of their most critical moments show how external pressures test the foundations of their operational methods. Dexter's season finales consistently placed him in scenarios where multiple threats converge simultaneously. The Ice Truck Killer's personal revelations while maintaining his relationship with Rita, the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation closing in while dealing with Lila's obsession, Trinity Killer's family targeting while managing his own domestic life, and the Nebraska killing spree while fleeing Miami. Each crisis tested different aspects of his adaptability, emotional compartmentalization, tactical flexibility, and the ability to maintain his core identity while everything else shifted. Joe's major crisis moments typically stem from his obsession spiraling beyond his control, Beck's growing suspicions coinciding with Peach's investigation, Love's murderous nature threatening his carefully crafted narrative, and the accumulating evidence from multiple jurisdictions forcing his constant relocations. His crises tend to be more personal and emotionally driven, testing his ability to maintain psychological control rather than operational security. The build-up to their most dangerous moments reveals different patterns of escalation and warning signs. When Dexter sensed investigations closing in, he typically began implementing contingency plans that had been developing in the background for months or years. His preparations for potential exposure, including escape routes, false identities, and evidence disposal protocols that could be activated quickly when needed. Dexter's crisis preparation also included emotional compartmentalization strategies, ways to maintain his relationship and normal life even as his secret life faced existential threats. His ability to continue functioning normally while under FBI surveillance during during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience. Joe's build-up to crisis moments shows a different pattern. His problems typically compound as his obsessive behaviors intensify rather than as external investigations close in. When Joe senses threats to his carefully constructed relationships, he tends to double down on the behaviors that created the problems in the first place. His response to Beck's growing suspicions was to increase his surveillance and manipulation rather than pull back and reassess. The main event analysis of their crisis management and improvisation skills reveals starkly different approaches to problem solving under extreme pressure. Dexter's crisis management follows the same methodical principles that govern his regular operations. Assess the situation, identify the most critical threats, prioritize responses based on likelihood of success, and execute with minimal deviation from proven methods. When confronted by FBI agent Lundy's investigation, Dexter didn't panic or dramatically alter his behavior. Instead, he used his forensic expertise to understand exactly what evidence existed, leveraged his relationships to gather evidence about the investigation's progress, and methodically eliminated the most dangerous threats while maintaining his cover. His improvisation skills are built on deep foundational knowledge. When forced to deviate from planned procedures, he draws on his understanding of forensic science, human psychology, and investigative methods to create new solutions that maintain his operational security. Joe's crisis management tends to be more reactive and emotionally driven. When faced with existential threats, Joe often makes decisions based on immediate emotional needs rather than long-term strategic considerations. His handling of Beck's discovery of his stalking behavior involved a series of increasingly desperate improvisations, lying, gaslighting, manipulation, and ultimately imprisonment that created more problems than they solved. Joe's improvisation skills are impressive in their creativity, but often lack the systematic thinking that would ensure long-term success. The aftermath of their crisis responses show dramatically different patterns of recovery and learning. Dexter's damage control strategies typically involve systematic cleanup that addresses both immediate threats and long-term vulnerabilities. After major crises, Dexter often emerges with refined methods and better operational security. His experience with Dokes led to better strategies for handling suspicious colleagues. His encounter with the Trinity Killer improved his family security protocols. His problem with Lumen taught him about the risk of emotional attachments. Dexter learns from near disasters and integrates those lessons into his operational framework. Joe's aftermath management shows a pattern of geographic relocation and identity reinvention rather than systematic improvement. When Joe's carefully constructed life in New York fell apart, his solution was to move to Los Angeles and start over rather than analyze what went wrong and develop better methods. His damage control often involves running away from problems rather than solving them, creating a pattern of repeated mistakes across different locations and identities. The recovery strategies reveal fundamental differences in their approaches to long-term sustainability. Dexter's recovery involves methodical reconstruction of his operational security, careful analysis of what went wrong, and systematic improvements to prevent similar problems in the future. His ability to maintain his position at Miami Metro even after multiple major investigations shows remarkable resilience and strategic thinking. Dexter's recoveries often leave him stronger and more secure than before the crisis. Joe's recovery strategies focus on emotional healing and relationship building rather than operational improvement. His moves to new cities represent fresh starts emotionally, but don't address the fundamental behavior patterns that created his previous problems. Joe's recoveries often recreate the same vulnerabilities that led to his previous crises. The question of who handles chaos better becomes clear when examining their decision-making under extreme pressure. Dexter's responses to chaos maintains logical consistency even when circumstances become bizarre or unprecedented. His ability to function normally while hiding a body in his apartment, to conduct forensic analysis on his own crime scenes, and maintain relationships while planning murders shows someone who thrives under pressure rather than being diminished by it. Joe's responses to chaos often involve increasingly irrational decisions that prioritize short-term emotional relief over long-term success. His tendency to create elaborate justifications for increasingly unjustifiable actions shows someone whose judgment deteriorates under pressure. Joe's panic responses would be his downfall against Dexter's cold calculation, because panic creates predictability, and Dexter excels at exploiting predictable behavior. When Joe faces existential threats, his response follows emotional patterns that someone with Dexter's analytical skills could easily identify and manipulate. Dexter's crisis responses, by contrast, maintain the same unpredictable precision that characterizes his normal operations. Joe spirals, Dexter adapts. If you're seeing the pattern here, hit that like button and let me know who you think would crack first if they ever met face to face. But even the deadliest killers have a soft spot, and someone always finds it. Every predator, no matter how skilled or experienced, carries with them seeds of their own destruction, vulnerabilities that transform their greatest strengths into exploitable weaknesses. Dexter Morgan's emotional attachments and Joe Goldberg's obsessive nature represent two fundamentally different types of fatal flaws that could be weaponized against them. While Dexter's weakness is his struggle to maintain human connections, despite his fundamental inability to feel them authentically, Joe's weakness is his compulsive need to possess and control the objects of his obsession, even when that obsession becomes self-destructive. The context of how personal relationships compromise each killer reveals the paradoxical nature of their vulnerabilities. Dexter's emotional attachments represent complement his attempts to appear normal and connect with his humanity, but they consistently place him in situations where his logical, methodical approach breaks down. His relationship with Rita forced him to consider someone else's safety and happiness in ways that often conflicted with his operational security. His love for Deborah created emotional blind spots that led to increasingly dangerous decisions. His paternal feelings for Harrison and Astor introduced unpredictable variables that his systematic approach couldn't account for. These relationships didn't just create emotional vulnerability, they forced Dexter to deviate from the proven methods that had kept him safe for decades. Joe's obsessive nature compromises him in the opposite way. His relationship aren't attempts to connect with humanity, but to possess and control it. His obsessions with Beck, Love, and Marianne were never actually about emotional growth, but about fulfilling his psychological need to be the center of someone else's universe. Joe's relationships consistently escalate beyond his ability to maintain them because obsession, by its very nature, demands increasing levels of control and involvement that eventually become unsustainable. Their biggest vulnerabilities and blind spots emerge from the intersection of their psychological needs and operational requirements. Dexter's greatest blind spot is his inability to recognize when his emotional attachments are compromising his judgment until it's too late. His decision to pursue Trinity Killer was partially motivated by his desire to understand how Arthur Mitchell maintained a family while killing, a personal interest that had led him to take unnecessary risks and ultimately resulted in Rita's death. His relationship with Lumen forced him to share his secret and work with a partner, violating fundamental principles of his operational security. Dexter's emotional attachments create situations where he prioritizes relationships over safety, often without fully recognizing the trade-offs he's making. Joe's biggest blind spot is his inability to recognize when his obsessions have moved beyond his control and into dangerous territory. His stalking behaviors escalate predictably. Social media monitoring leads to physical surveillance, which leads to breaking and entering, which leads to manipulation and eventually violence. Joe consistently believes that he can manage and control his obsessions even as they spiral into increasingly dangerous territory that threatens his operational security. The scenarios where these weaknesses could be exploited reveal how each killer's strength becomes their downfall. Dexter's emotional attachments could be exploited by someone who understood his psychological need for human connection and his guilt over his inability to feel emotions authentically. A skilled manipulator could use his relationships with family members, colleagues, or romantic partners as leverage, forcing them to choose between his operational security and the safety of the people he cares about. The most dangerous scenario for Dexter would involve someone threatening his loved ones in ways that couldn't be solved through his usual methodical approach, situations requiring immediate emotional responses rather than calculated planning. Joe's obsessive nature could be exploited by someone who understood his psychological triggers and could manipulate his fixations. The most effective approach would involve giving Joe a target that appeared perfect for his obsessions, but was actually a trap designed to exploit his predictable behavioral patterns. Someone who could present themselves as the ideal object of obsession while secretly documenting Joe's escalating stalking behaviors could gather enough evidence to destroy him. In a direct confrontation between them, Joe's obsessive nature would likely be more exploitable than Dexter's emotional attachments. If Joe became obsessed with Dexter, and given Joe's patterns of fixating on mysterious, unavailable individuals, this would be almost inevitable. His behavior would become increasingly predictable and dangerous to his own operational security. Joe's obsessions follow consistent patterns: initial idealization, intensive research and surveillance, manufacturing counters, escalating control attempts, and finally, violence when control fails. Dexter, with his forensic background and understanding of predatory behavior, would likely recognize these patterns and could manipulate them to his advantage. Dexter's emotional attachments, while creating a vulnerability, don't follow predictable patterns in the same way. His emotional responses are often delayed, compartmentalized, or intellectualized in ways that would make them harder for Joe to identify and exploit quickly enough to be useful in a confrontation. If Joe became obsessed with Dexter, his research would eventually uncover aspects of Dexter's double life that law enforcement had missed for years. However, this same obsession would make Joe increasingly visible to someone with Dexter's investigative skills and forensic expertise. Joe's digital stalking, physical surveillance, and escalating contact attempts would create evidence that Dexter could use against him. If Dexter's emotional attachments were threatened, his response might become uncharacteristically emotional and reactive, potentially creating opportunities for Joe to exploit. However, even an emotional Dexter would likely maintain more operational discipline than obsessed Joe. If Dexter were to exploit Joe's obsessive nature, he would likely present himself as an ideal target for obsession while secretly documenting Joe's stalking behavior and gathering evidence of his criminal activities. Dexter's forensic expertise would allow them to build an airtight case against Joe while maintaining his own operational security. If Joe were to exploit Dexter's emotional attachments, he would likely target Dexter's family members or romantic interests, forcing Dexter into increasingly desperate and uncharacteristic responses that could expose his true nature. Both have fatal flaws, but Joe's obsession makes makes it more predictable in ways that someone with Dexter's analytical skills and forensic expertise could easily exploit. While Dexter's emotional attachments create genuine vulnerability, they don't follow the same compulsive patterns that characterize Joe's obsessions. Joe's need to possess and control would eventually lead him to take risk and make decisions that prioritize his psychological needs over his operational security. Exactly the kind of predictable behavior that Dexter excels at identifying and exploiting. In the real world, the only way that Joe would survive is if he never crossed paths with Dexter. Make sure you subscribe, because next time we're breaking down the reasons why Dexter Resurrection could be a failure.